And the moderator for this session is Miss Claire Amritstead.
Thank you all for being here. The title of this session is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And when somebody asked me what the next session I was going to chair was, and I said that title, they said, oh, you mean the play by Edward Albee? No, this is very much about Virginia Woolf. And there are ways in which people frighten Virginia Woolf. Have I lost I'm losing it a little bit. No, that's all right. There are many ways in which people are frightened of Virginia Woolf. People can be frightened of the text. Texts are thought to be challenging. I think, is this better? Good. There are many ways in which people are frightened of Virginia Woolf, one of which is that the text themselves. That is probably the primary one, that she is challenging. She set a whole new template for ways of writing, and we will explore that. I know that Adrian will talk to that. But she also set a way of living and a way of being in the world. And I'd like to explore that as well, about what she says to our times now, being in the world. And I'd like to explore that as well, about what she says to our times now. She talks, as well as being a sort of a high literary figure, one of the sort of key points of modernism, she's also raises questions about gender and about the body, which I think are coming into a complete new resonance now. So I think almost all the modernist writers, the writers from the early part of the 20th century, if anything, she's growing with time. And these are some of the issues that we will be investigating now. And we all have very different takes on this. So I hope you'll bear with us. This will be a very rich and varied discussion, and I hope there'll be a little bit of time for you to ask some questions at the end. And I'm going to start by turning to Emma Woolf, who is the great-grandniece, are you? The great-niece of Virginia Woolf. So she has a personal continuity with Virginia through her father, who was her nephew. Yes, I've got it right. These are very tricky. Now, Emma has a particular take on her. Emma's own area of books so far have been connected with the body and connected with her own story of anorexia and being a working woman, struggling to find a place as a working woman within a very sort of consumerist society with very fixed ideas of what a woman should look like, what a woman should be. So you relate in a very autobiographical and biographical way to Virginia's story, don't you? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, thank you all for such a warm welcome. I studied Virginia at Oxford and loved her books. Obviously, from being a child, I knew about Virginia and listened to my father's stories about Virginia. And Leonard, he was very close to Leonard Woolf, who I understand is a big noise in Sri Lanka, where Leonard was a civil servant for many years and is much loved in Ceylon. But that's Leonard. But Virginia, I studied her and always loved her work. It was only recently when I started reading her diaries and her letters that she really came alive for me as a person. And I began to just become fascinated with her as a woman and all the struggles she had. And I mean, there are so many myths and misconceptions, I think, about Virginia Woolf. Everybody's heard of her, and most people, I don't know, most people haven't read her. Has everybody in the... Does anyone want to do a show of hands of who has read Virginia Woolf? Well, that's really impressive. That's a lot of people. But in London, you have this thing where your taxi driver's heard of Virginia Woolf. Everybody's heard of her. And it's funny, she's this household name, but she's actually quite a difficult modernist writer, in a way. So I find her fascinating on so many levels.
So, Adrian, your approach to her is very much through the text. You're an award-winning poet, you're an essayist, and you're interested in modernism from the textual point of view. And particularly, you've written about her great novels, For the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. Tell us a little bit about your connection with Virginia Woolf.
May I be permitted to read a poem on To the Lighthouse? I've written a poem called Lighthouse, because that will lead into my discussion. Thank you. This is called Lighthouse, Lines for Virginia Woolf. Time broke, and you saw its petals scatter, standing all air in Mrs. Ramsay's hat. and glove with its twisted finger on the shore, as the wave tumbled and broke, evoking sky and the journey she never made to the lighthouse. In a world shaken by war, you mocked your own dirge of transience, culling bouquets of moments. Treks to town for tobacco, newspapers, the cottage crowded with children, shells, reeds, stones, seaweed, high-pitched, fleeting voices, rabbits sheltering in mole burrows. Someone had blundered was your refrain. Not just Jasper putting the starlings to flight, but the chasm behind the whole inadvertent arc of life. Then a last supper, a betrayal by time before the war. And all the while, a picture grew in the open, delivering stealthily, shapes in abstract, a child, a woman, and a tree, and boulders in your pockets, your tryst with destiny. May I say a few words?
Yes.
To me, all fiction is esoteric. I said this the other day somewhere. And Virginia Woolf is particularly so. She is, in fact, for me, her texts are a moment of ecstasy and terror. And I don't mean ecstasy in a sort of common romantic sense. I mean it in a quasi-mystical sense. It's a kind of, what we see in Virginia Woolf is a kind of ecstasis, a lifting out of ordinary perception into a heightened form of perception, into poetry, in fact, no less than pure poetry. And we see in Virginia Woolf something which transcends the topical or the literal, the everyday. That somewhere is what the novel To the Lighthouse certainly is about, and is that way. I think she transcends the purely literal and topical and everyday, and is able to achieve something very few writers achieve, in other words, a form of extraordinary transcendence. So, to me, this matters a lot, and she's moves from doesn't produce subject matter writing. She doesn't write about this or that. It's far beyond that. That to me is something we must take into account. And, and we don't read Virginia Woolf. I think if we read her properly, we commune with her. And that's the way, at least, I see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Someone who I think probably needs no introduction in this room, Zareena Saeed, who describes herself very modestly as an educator, teacher, that I suspect has been very important in the lives of people in this room, who takes a slightly different view again. And we were having a fascinating conversation about what she means particularly to young women now, and what her feminist writings mean. So, Zareena.
Thank you. For me, when I look at her writing, her body of writing, for me, it is not, and I share this with my students as well, it begins with the whole notion of a room of one's own. She gives space to it. And she points out the fact, and it's not the room that she provides, is not just pertaining or limiting to a woman alone. She takes the woman a step ahead, and she tries to merge the two genders together. And it is the androgynous approach that appeals to me. That those separations that we are so fond of separating a man and a woman, not realizing that we need both. And this is not something new. She follows in the tradition of, let's say, as a matter of fact, to quote her own words, she turns around and says, the best writers are androgynous in nature. And she talks about Shakespeare and all the times who have portrayed women in the most beautiful manner, and not as just objects. For me, that is it. And then the fact that she looks around and shows women that it is not just in the writing, it is not through the power of the word, it is questioning, who am I? And this journey in a text like A Room of One's Own, one is reminded of Alice Walker, who writes in Our Mother's Garden. And then the impact that has, that you look around and you find why is my portrait not hanging? Where are the female narratives? Who are? And then she does it beautifully in one of her texts, Orlando, by creating that fusion. And for me, that is fascinating.
And do you think that she wrote Orlando in 1928? It was published in 1928. And the passage of one sets into another.
Yes,
this is a really radical thing to propose.
It's going a man and a woman fusion through history, looking at the way history would have been read if it would have been a woman's perspective. She brings in Shakespeare's sister. And how would she have reacted? And these are the lines that I feel as a reader, as a student of literature. And literature, for me, is not just limited to a classroom. Literature is out there. It is in our pulse. And hence, when we read any text, you don't have to be a student of literature. Some of the best students of literature have never sat in a literature class. But the thing is, the fact that you can relate to her and you can see that she is not limited to a time period, she's not limited to a particular space, and she is looking at the fusion. And today's world, you do realize that we have moved beyond isms. We are, and I'm not talking about social problems, I'm talking about the mind. A true mind does see a release and a fusion between the two genders. That's how I take it.
So, I don't know whether any of you were at the David Bowie session this morning. There was a fantastic session about David Bowie, which sort of looked at all the different, what he did about androgyny. And I think that actually it's not just about literature, it's about the artist and the androgyny of the artist, and that goes across fashion, literature, art, music. And I wondered, and it involves the body, doesn't it, Emma? So, you know, your take on is a much broader cultural take on her relationship with her body.
Yeah, I've written at times about Virginia and her mental illness, which I think is incredibly interesting. I mean, she struggled all her life. She had repeated nervous breakdowns. Her first nervous breakdown was in 1895, when she was only 13, on the age of death of her mother. And then she had further nervous breakdowns in the early 1900s, again when she married Leonard, again. He kept her alive. She had about 4 or 5 very severe nervous breakdowns throughout her life. So Virginia's relationship with these breakdowns and with her mental illness and how that informs her writing is fascinating. And yes, her body, it's a very interesting subject because I think that Virginia is portrayed as someone who was very stern, someone who was either frigid or she was a lesbian. She wasn't motherly, she wasn't warm, she wasn't very nice, she was anti-Semitic. All these sort of stereotypes that we have about Virginia are actually far from accurate. She longed to have children. She and Leonard really, really wanted to be parents. She wanted to be a mother, and it's absolutely heartbreaking when you read in her diaries the sadness, the depth of that sadness and the sense of loss, and how she looks at Vanessa Bell, her big sister, who was an artist, a popular artist in the Bloomsbury group, and she sort of envies Vanessa, all these children. And again, into The Lighthouse, if you've read To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Ramsay, surrounded by her children. So there's that kind of fecundity, that maternal instinct that Virginia never fulfilled and wasn't able to because of her mental illness. And so I think her relationship with the body is complicated. And I've written about how I think now that actually she may have had some form of eating disorder, possibly anorexia, although whether or not we call it anorexia in the early 20th century, of course, is a moot point.
There are descriptions of Leonard trying to feed her and him saying every meal is a struggle.
Every meal is a struggle, and he monitored her weight, he monitored her menstrual cycles. He was very liberated for a man in the early 20th century.
Or controlling, you could say.
He kept her alive. He really wasn't controlling. Leonard gave up his life's work, he gave up all his political ambitions to keep Virginia alive. She talks of him, when she's in the grip of her madness, she talks about him as a jailer, but he was not controlling, he was looking after her, he was keeping her alive. And I don't know whether it was anorexia, because it wasn't primarily about eating and food, it was primarily the mental illness, which then, as the voices rose up, she would stop eating. So it was a very complicated thing, but yeah, her relationship with the body is fascinating, absolutely.
And connected with that is her relationship with the idea of what it is to be a woman and to be a writer. And Adrian has echoed in his lovely poem some of the brilliant phrases she came up with. And one of the most famous phrases ever is from her essay, A Room of One's Own, which is, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction."
I think what Emma has just said, maybe that was a way to control her body. And if you read Ensler, she does talk about the body.
Eve Ensler.
Yes, Eve Ensler.
You know, we're talking about Eve Ensler.
Eve Ensler, if you look at her body of work, then at times the woman control, given that she doesn't have space, and it is very interesting to note that here is a woman who is a privileged woman. It's not a woman who is a marginalized woman, who is an economically independent woman, yet she's thinking of the possibilities of women who do not have all that she has. And it is from a position of advantage. But it is also important to note that in spite of having all those advantages, the whole stress factor of knowing, it's like your Keatsian protagonist in a poem like, La Belle Sans Mercy, that she has tasted manna, and as having tasted that, she not suddenly, but gradually realizes that it is a sorry condition. And the only way when I read that, is that it is her body that she's punishing. And Eve Ensler, in her work also then takes this further ahead. She's a living writer, she's a modernist, she is quite an important voice. She then shows us, yes, there is a point there. There are women who have then the only tool or weapon in their hand which they can control and hence not allow any space. And if you, when I look at all these aspects, I am also reminded of the fact that it's not something new that is happening. It has been happening earlier. For example, in a novel like Hardy's Tess of the Riverbands, Tess does disfigure herself in order to save herself from all the attention she gets. And that, once again, can be seen as a form of distorting the body that leads to trouble.
But women have been doing this since the medieval. I mean, since the medieval mystics, women have been turning. Men go to war, and women turn against themselves. Women attack their own bodies because perhaps they don't have the power to be outwardly destructive. But I mean, Virginia and Leonard were very democratic. They worked. They would both write every morning. They would write their 500 words, and then they would write their articles to try and earn some money, and then they would have lunch and dig in the garden. And they really worked together. They were a wonderful writing partnership.
They were also printers and publishers of other people's work, and that's something that people forget about Adrian. They were really important, weren't they, as sort of marshalling a sense of what it was to be modern in the world.
May I address a few of my concerns here? This is important to me. I'm greatly concerned about the fact that biography should be something that determines how we read Virginia Woolf's texts. I think there are lots of givens, which we know a lot of things about Virginia Woolf. Her life is public property, more or less. And we know about her so-called homoeroticism, we know about the mother loss, we know about her childhood with St. Ives, we know about her manic depression, we know about her suicide. But surely we ought to be focusing on the text, the different texts, particularly Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. And to me this, here I am, a beleaguered male among feminists, trying to put forward this view that, that perhaps it's more, and Mrs. Saeed, Zareena Saeed mentioned Orlando quite appropriately. The only thing is, I think that the point that Virginia Woolf is making, is that somehow gender is ultimately irrelevant, it's transcended, it doesn't matter. She's far beyond gender. She's not just a woman.
Not true. She adored women. She says, women, why is it that women are so much more interesting to women
She's not there to
than
say,
men are?
The books are saying it. She's saying a difference. She's making a different statement about men. Mr. Ramsey, I agree with that. I mean, there is this kind of feminine stand, but the feminist space is, the feminine space is much wider than I think is being assumed here. And it's much, much bigger. And also we have no right to assume that we know what modernism is all about. And it's, to me, it's about meaning. It's about, I think, to me, for instance, To the Lighthouse is an allegory involving meaning. What does it mean, Lady Briscoe says at the beginning of The Lighthouse, And I think we ought to remind ourselves that meaning was something that T.S. Eliot was profoundly concerned with also. In Prufrock, he talks about, he mentions meaning, or he refers to meaning in the lines where we see Prufrock saying, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. That is repeated twice over. And there is a great concern with meaning and the transition in sort of Victorian times from humanism to modernism, or Victorianism to modernity or modernism. This understanding of modernity and modernism is frightfully important, Yasho. The issue of modernity or modernism is a frightfully important one, and it was something that pervades Forster's text as well.
Can I just stop you there, and we'll come back to that, because I think that's a really important point. Emma?
I was just going to add to what Adrian was saying. Of course, they didn't call it modernism at the time. We give these sort of literary movements a label afterwards. But Virginia genuinely did feel that she was doing something new. It was called Stream of Consciousness, and of course it's what you read when you read To the Lighthouse, which is a very different kind of writing to, say, the people that she'd been reading, Dickens or Galsworthy. It's the feeling of writing life as it happens, as we all experience it. That feeling of reality being on the inside. It's not on the outside. It's not about plot and structure, although she did have plot and she did have structure, and her novels are carefully structured. But for Virginia, it was about stream of consciousness and about the flow of a day, the flow, the way that a trip, as in Mrs. Dalloway, a trip to buy the flowers for her party that evening. How can that be an entire novel? That was a profoundly experimental thing to do. And yet, that's what she's doing. And it was the very start of modernism, and it's really exciting. But also, to pick up on what Claire said, the Hogarth Press, that's what she and Leonard set up. They set up these printing press, which is still going. And they were the first people to publish T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And they were great friends with Tom Eliot. And they published all sorts of really exciting modernist writers. Although Virginia turned down Ulysses, because she said it was far too obscene.
They were all rather snooty about James Joyce, weren't they? All that lot. I mean, Forster as well.
They were terribly snobby about D.H. Lawrence.
And D.H. Lawrence. So there was a sort of downside to them, wasn't there? And that was also partly of their time and of their class. And it's sort of, they were invested in their times as well as liberating themselves from them.
And this point makes it very interesting that the whole complexity, and I would like to go back to the title of the topic, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Maybe it is this complexity, and on one hand they are dismissive or not very happy with D.H. Lawrence, to use a more appropriate word, and yet they are the ones who are talking about freedom. So there is this certain complexity, and I agree with Adrian that yes, you cannot lump a writer, and a writer, any writer as a matter of fact, and especially if it happens to be a complex writer, who, as Emma has pointed out, is working in a new tradition, who's working and laying down further ground. And she's working at a time where, along with her, there's Joyce there, there's a whole new movement, and yet also not conscious that she's working under some umbrella, which we will later on, and by we I do not mean myself, but the later generations, are going to term as modernism or postmodernism or thisism or thatism. It is this complexity which makes her an interesting artist, an interesting writer to grapple with all the time. And hence, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't walk out with a consensus that who is afraid of Virginia Woolf? We'd all end a little bit afraid of whether we have been able to tackle her or not.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And hopefully this session will at least send people back to read Virginia Woolf, which is the aim of it. But I now want to go a bit more into what she was doing, into the literature of it. So, what does stream of consciousness mean, and how does it relate to modernism? You posed the question that we need to interrogate what modernism means.
Well, modernism is more than just about stream of consciousness and the multiple perspective. Because with stream of consciousness, we move to the multiple perspective from the single viewpoint to the multiple kind of viewpoint, from multiple perspective. Sorry about that. So basically, I mean, I've written about cutting bouquets of moments. All these moments, simultaneous moments, have been made coherent in an aesthetic whole. And I think that is something that has to be borne in mind with Virginia Woolf. But she's not. To me, this assumption that somewhere she's kind of perpetuating a given technique. It's not a technique. It's much bigger. It's much deeper. And it's much more profound in Virginia Woolf. But I will come back for a second to the issue of meaning, which is present in Eliot, which is present in Virginia Woolf, and is present in Forster. The huge gap, the communication gap, for instance, in Forster, in the passage to India between colonizers and colonized, which is what that novel to me is all about. That gap exists into The Lighthouse as well, between Mr. Ramsay and his wife, Mrs. Ramsay. It's ostensibly a very innocent issue, the issue of weather that sort of divides them. But that is very much there. So to me, this is a much more relevant issue as far as modernity is concerned. This transition to modernism involves something which was very profound, and that was this great anguish about meaning and what meaning was all about, where it was going, and whether empiricism was something to be accepted or whether doubt was more in order. That was something that modernism was all about, as far as I'm concerned.
So part of what it did was it permitted different perspectives to have equal status. I mean, this is not stream of consciousness. This is the other side of it, in a way, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we need to ask Emma this question, that what were her findings when she looked into this particular body of research?
I don't know. I mean, I feel with Virginia that what she says is she's trying to get at the truth. She's trying to get at the reality of how life is actually lived. It's not about linear time, is it? A bus journey, if you're in love, can be, it can take an age. I don't know, if you're waiting for... Life doesn't happen as it's written down on the page in the plot of a novel. And what Virginia was trying to do through her novels was get at how we actually experience life. She talks about how it can be the buttons on the coat of the person sitting opposite you on the omnibus, on the London omnibus, can be more real than, what day of the week it is. And I think that's true. It's about the internal life. And how do you write about the internal life? And really, until Virginia Woolf, people hadn't written so much about the internal life. And that, to me, and that runs through all her novels. And I've studied them from an academic perspective, of course. But you don't need an academic perspective. All you need to be as a reader and a human being to appreciate how we experience life, and that's how she writes.
But what we haven't quite sort of teased out yet is it's not just about her exploring interiority and changing things, but what she did in literature has changed the way we are, and I think that's true of all sorts of art forms. So you think of film. We now, when we look at the structure of works of art, we look at literature, we inevitably we use the techniques of film, we use jump cuts, we use flashbacks and things. Likewise with Virginia Woolf, the stream of consciousness, the continuity within a mind which casts different perspectives on things, the possibility of lots of different people experiencing something entirely differently in an internal way. These are things that, would they be possible without Virginia Woolf? They've grown on that rootstock that she put down.
I agree with you, because if you look at just the title, A Room of One's Own, that has become the consciousness of every woman. Do I have a room of my own? And I'm not talking about just the spatial construct, I mean the mental space also. Am I allowed, if you look at the body of literature that is produced by women, and specifically I'm looking at women, this has been a major concern. Look at Sylvia Plath, talking about getting up early in the morning because she didn't have the space to write. Look at other writers as well. We've had, in the last LLF session, we had a whole session on this very need for space. And they were all women who came from different backgrounds. Yet the common problem was the lack of space. And for that, I feel we owe her a big one. And it is not that women were not conscious, but making you realize that, making you question, do do I have space? And that space is not limited, I repeat. Do I have the space for people to acknowledge me in the social sphere? It is not just my mental space, it's not just my immediate space, but the space that I have as a woman in society. Am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to? And coming from my part of the world, this is a question that has still to be answered. We have and if I look at the developed world, there is this very famous case from Columbia University where the woman, the child, the girl who was assaulted, was carrying on that mattress because she was not given the space to articulate her assault. She was not allowed, and this was, mind you, an academic space. So you just can't limit it to, articulating your thought. It is the layers that she brings to this particular metaphor. It has become, you just, in a conversation, you just don't have to, like me, rant on, but you can just say, I don't have a space of my own, I don't have a room of my own, and a whole meaning is pushed towards you. It's like a tornado that has been released. And that is what, for me, should make us not afraid of Virginia Woolf. That here is and then it's not just men. Let's move on. Adrian has rightly said that we can't limit her to just a feminist perspective. And given the world that we are living in, we have moved beyond feminism. We are still struggling. I'm not saying we won the war, but the thing is that now we have realized that it has to be an all-embracingism. It cannot just sort of us and them in terms of the men and the female. It is all of us together. We need to fight for our space. And that space is what is important. And that is what I take when I read and when I communicate with my literature students, that this is the realization. And giving you a tongue, giving you that eye, that it is while she's sitting at a conference, she looks at the walls and she turns around and sees that the women produce these men, and yet there's no mention. All the donations to Oxford and Cambridge are the men. What about the women who gave this money to their husbands or to their sons or to their father's property? None of them has been acknowledged, at least in her time. And it is this consciousness that as a woman, I feel, okay, if I've earned my bit of money, then I want my name somewhere. And it is not to be brushed under a surname, which is a coupled one too. So that for me is my understanding, reading of Virginia Woolf. Her text is the gospel. We cannot go beyond the text because it is the text through which she explores. Even as Adrian was talking about to the lighthouse, I was constantly reminded of a line, the last line of the novel where Lily turns around and says, yes, she thought laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I've had my vision. And for me, that is important.
And it's that final line of To the Lighthouse, when Lily, the painter, says, I have had my vision, is very similar to in the diaries when she's finishing The Waves, which she wrote in, I think it was her last book in 1941, just before her suicide, although I'd have to check that. And she says, I reeled across the last 10 pages of my book. And it's, if you're a writer, you know that feeling of finishing a book. And it's the dream that you have, that you'll finish the last 10 pages in this kind of ecstasy of artistic vision. Normally it's not actually like that, but anyway. She writes about finishing The Waves, and it's very similar to how she writes about Lily finishing To the Lighthouse. But on space as well. Virginia used to write in the bath, and the servants would be downstairs, and they could hear her up in the bath in the mornings, Mrs. Woolf, sort of eating away at her breakfast and writing with a board over the top of the bath, which is a wonderful space to find for your writing.
I'm going to take it back to Adrian, and her three great novels, probably her greatest novels, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando. Would you say those are the greatest novels? Is The Waves?
The Waves.
You think The Waves? And they were written in the 1920s. She didn't die until 1941. She had this fantastically creative few years. She was writing them one a year in the second half of the 1920s. What was it that was happening for her then, at that particular moment?
I'm more interested, as I've already said several times, in the text. What's happening is something that we are not considering actually closely enough. What's happening is very curious, for instance, into the lighthouse. Theme is being replaced by form. An extraordinary...
Say that again.
Sorry. Theme is being replaced by form. An idyll, we are presented with an idyll in the first part of the novel, which is called Window, where the family is together, the children are there, everybody's there, in this extraordinary kind of sense of well-being and so on. That is destroyed in the next part to the lighthouse, where Mrs. Ramsay dies. The central character, this to me is crucial to an understanding of the lighthouse. The central character dies, and it's for me a massive sacrificial gambit by Virginia Woolf to kind of try to understand whether the multiple perspective worked, was relevant, was viable or not, and whether centrality mattered more. And to me, Mrs. Ramsay embodies classical sympathy. To me, what Virginia Woolf is saying somewhere is that nothing is possible without a center. And the center is what Lily Briscoe at the end is also aiming at. So somewhere it's his concern with form, because it's form that takes over from theme. That is a vital point as far as I'm concerned.
I also wanted to come in about, Claire mentioned the 1920s and what was happening, and although Adrian and I disagree on this one, I think it's crucial to remember, okay, the 1920s, finally the First World War was over. It's that gap, it's that crucial gap between the First World War and the Second World War. Virginia was writing in London in the 1914 to 18 with bombs dropping overhead. There were German Zeppelins. You have to realise that the wars also exacerbated her mental illness, and she had a break between breakdowns. It's a wonderfully creative time. It really matters. It's not that the texts don't stand on their own, because they absolutely do. But for me, understanding that, understanding her sadness at not having children, understanding her relationship with Leonard, understanding her relationship with her family, it all adds layers to the text. It all deepens one's understanding. So I think the 1920s were, personally for her, an extremely creative time because of those actual events that were happening. That sets it in context.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a moment there. I think it's very important to point out that Virginia Woolf was deeply involved with post-impressionist painting, and that there was this extraordinary exhibition organized by Roger Fry in 1910, and that before that, a painting, a very well-known painting, had been produced by Picasso called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in which perspective had been destroyed. It had been flattened. Theme had been replaced by form. I do believe that Virginia Woolf was intellectually deeply influenced by the movement in art, and she did say that everything changed, as far as character was concerned, everything changed in the year 1910. She's known to have said that. So this is something we cannot forget at all.
And she stood up at her writing desk to write, because like the painters, all the painters around her were standing up at their easels.
So, Zareena, theme had been replaced by form.
Yes, and then the form is in keeping with the time. Because as Eva has pointed out, that if the artist and the creative artist can be seen in many forms. Somebody is taking up the brush, somebody is taking up the pen. And if Picasso has done that, she finds her expression through her work. And that is what she's interested in. But within that form, if we are going to turn around and say there is no theme, there is a method to the madness. As a young, if you come initially to a text, you wonder what is happening to you, because here you're coming from, as taking a point from Adrian, you have been brought up, nurtured on the theme, chapter division, chapter headings, and suddenly you are thrown at the deep end of the pool. You are told that the theme, you have to go to the deep end, hunt out the theme for yourself, find out the threads, and then work it out. You are not going to, and I'm not going to tell you that what is it, you have to work it out. And the more richer your reading experience, the more experience of life is, you're going to end up finding your own form. That's how I understand
But your metaphor, since you were talking earlier very eloquently about the importance of metaphor, the metaphor, the deep end, brings us onto the waves. Now, I saw Emma wince when I said 3 great novels and missed out the waves. Tell us about the waves. The waves is really challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, and Virginia talks about it as her most experimental novel. I think it gave her a lot of trouble, and she calls it a prose poem. And The Waves is, to my mind, is her most beautiful novel. It's structured both in the form of a life, so from childhood, 6 characters, so it's very, very structured. 6 characters, 3 women, 3 men. It's the course of a sunrise to a sunset over the long novel, and it's also the course of their life from childhood to old age and death. And they meet up periodically through their lives. And it's wonderful. And I was only wincing slightly when the other two say about themes, because I think her novels do have themes. I really do. I mean, yes, they were experimental, but the themes are Mrs. Dalloway, okay, women, family, children. Jacob's Room, war, young men going away to the war. To the Lighthouse, again, family, women. Any one of her novels, we can find very, very clear themes that Virginia was interested in. The Years, Night and Day. All of them are about women, about women's role in the world.
About food and catering. A lot of food and catering by women.
Food comes into it a lot, yes, and Virginia's diaries are obsessed with food. You have to remember, this was during the war, 2 world wars. They had shortages. They couldn't get butter, they couldn't get cheese, they couldn't get eggs. She talks about having to, argue with the servants about what they could and couldn't get. It's fascinating to remember what conditions they were actually writing in. And she was lucky. I mean, they had a bit of money and they had houses in the country and things like that. But yeah, she's obsessed with food and the meals in To the Lighthouse and the meals in A Room of One's Own. The meals play a central role.
Yes, thank you, Emma. That was wonderfully enlightening. I wanted to say that we ought perhaps also to, as far as The Waves is concerned, it is an entirely experimental novel. As far as I know, it precedes Mrs. Dalloway. It came before Mrs. Dalloway. It's among the novels that preceded To the Lighthouse too. You can check on this, I checked on it. Anyway, The Waves is profoundly experimental.
Can I just we've got a disagreement here about
The Waves was written in the late 1930s. Mrs. Dalloway was 1922, and To the Lighthouse.
Well, that's
1920s.
Your word against mine. We'll check out later. Anyway, the point is, let's just say, The Waves is entirely experimental. It is exploring multiple perspectives, which is something she explores in a much more complex way into The Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. And I think it's important to bear in mind how we see fiction becoming fiction in a very extraordinary way into The Lighthouse. And that we'll return again to the Ramsays and the kind of divide between them, the gap in communication. Because what we see the male in To the Lighthouse associated with is literalism, as compared to the symbolic perception, the symbolic reality of the female. It's somewhere about literal reality, empirically verifiable reality, versus contrasted with the imagination. So there's this great gap between the two. I think there's much more, quite honestly, I'm not on an ego trip. I am deeply concerned about, what's happening in. I didn't, by the way, Zareena, say that there was no theme. What I said was the theme is deconstructed. It's there, but it's deconstructed, and for very good reasons, by Virginia Woolf. So basically, that's the way I see it.
Well, I'm beginning to feel a bit sorry for Mrs. Dalloway. We've talked a lot about Mrs. Ramsay, not about Mrs. Dalloway.
If we're going to go by the books, then we have to spend more than the allocated time. But Mrs. Dalloway also, looking at the whole food syndrome that we are looking at, she is throwing a party. And there is this whole, and she keeps that aside, and she just steps out. And that takes her to the whole, if we are going to look at psychology as well, a whole free association set of patterns that come on. And as a student of literature, when you look at a text, I don't think there is just one meaning to a text. And we just cannot, as soon as you finish, I mean, the example that I have in mind is Charlotte Bronte wrote her Jane Eyre way back. And a modern living, correct me if I'm wrong, she writes, she looks at the text and she finds something wrong with it. And she takes a strand out and writes her White Sagacity. And you change the whole perspective on Rochester. I have a difficult time. At one point I've been teaching this particular text. And when the young girls come in or the young boys come in, they have a very different vision of Rochester as the He-Man. And ask them to do a parallel reading and they feel they've been cheated. So in the same manner, when we're looking at A novel, B novel or C novel, whether it's Clarissa Dalloway, her relationship, Septimus, I mean, is the novel about Clarissa or is it about the character of Septimus? Because he goes on a parallel level.
But, and doesn't it add to it to know that Virginia's beloved brother was killed in a few years before she wrote about Septimus Smith killing himself? Doesn't it add to know that she identified her younger brother, beloved Toby, with Jacob in Jacob's room? To me, it adds so many layers when we understand that, because Virginia was writing about what she'd experienced and what she knew, and all the young men that were dying in the war at the time she was writing.
Yes, and I may add what Adrian said, that the death of the mother in the lighthouse. Now, if you are looking from the lens of the biography, then that is important, because the first breakdown she has is after the death of her mother. So hence, as borrowing Adrian's word, the center cannot hold. As soon as she dies, the center gets scattered. So we will have to look at her from all angles. We just cannot limit her. And the more you know her, the more you fall in love with her, then the more you realize it's like somebody who's presented as a stern figure, and as Emma said, that somebody who's, we're not used to the language, we're not used, this is a new form that is emerging, we've just been trained to go through chapter divisions and chapter, the headings. We are told everything's given to us, and suddenly we are told, hold on, this is the deep end, you read and you find out. So that becomes a whole exercise, which really challenges you.
And her servants used to say that Virginia was so funny she had them in stitches. So it's a lovely kind of different perspective on this woman that we think is a really difficult modernist. She's not at all. And I would definitely recommend starting with the diaries and the letters if you're starting to read her.
I'm going to open it out to the audience now. Do we have a microphone for the audience? Yes, so a gentleman in the second row just there. Can you ask questions and keep your questions brief, because we don't have very much time for people.
We have talked about her depiction of internal life. Regarding external life, and this is her work Voyage Out. And can we talk about that even from the post-colonial perspective, if there is any involved?
So, Zareena, you were a teacher of post-colonial, so the Voyage Out and the external life.
Well, that would take another session to address that particular question. But then, can you separate any particular text written in that particular period, right from the 18th century, an Austen novel, which does not address implicitly or explicitly the post-colonial question? I mean, it does.
There are lots of parallels with The Voyage Out and, of course, Joseph Conrad.
Yeah.
The name completely escapes me. The Joseph Conrad book. Heart of Darkness, thank you. Yes. But also, it was her first book. You have to remember that. It was Virginia's first novel. She was barely 30. It was published in 1915. So she was trying things out. And you can see how she becomes much more experimental. The Voyage Out still has much more plot, doesn't it, than when you look at something like The Waves at the end of her career, which is almost doing away with those kind of plot structures. But The Voyage Out is, I think, one of her best.
Sorry. Have we got another one? Another question? So we're all afraid of Virginia Woolf. Just another one in the front row.
I think you've made us more afraid of Virginia Woolf.
Well, that's interesting. Tell us, explain why.
For the simple reason that I think that we have simplified her to biography, to which is of course important, but I'm not as diplomatic as Mrs. Saeed. She's been very kind in trying to, in a sense, get everything together. I think that what Adrian Husain had to say does require a more serious session, which goes into form, which goes into style, and which obviously...
But the trouble is, this is a generalist audience, so that's not where we
Well,
are.
perhaps that is why we are so scared of Virginia Woolf. Because she does require a degree of engagement which has a level of gravitas. And I'm sorry, I'm not looking down on a populist or a generalist audience. But if you are looking at a writer, you need to look at those aspects more seriously.
But that would require everybody to have the text in front of them, I think.
Not necessarily.
Excuse me.
There's
a gentleman. Thank you for that point. We take the criticism. There's somebody just at the back in an orange shirt, about halfway back. Is there someone down there as well? Okay, well, sorry, I didn't see you. You're next. Okay.
These authors sort of, they opened up a new perspective. You address every audience. And I mean, especially with women, especially with this audience that we're looking at, that's definitely a huge issue. And
do you have a question?
No, I was gonna just.
I'm very glad. Thank you for that defence. That was nice. So I think we've got somebody down right in the front of me. Yes, somebody right down in the front.
All right. Well, I have a question, but first of all, I like to share. Well, I was 15 the first time I read Room of Unknown, and other than all feminist theory aside, that one book changed my entire life. How I could suddenly see how different it was to be a woman, and qualitatively, and how much had happened since the 1920s and 30s, and how women had won their space and it had not been handed out to them. And to see my mother's life through that book and understand that she needed her space and she was fighting for her space in my house, with my father, in her society, in our society. My question, probably the three of you could not really relate or answer as well as you could. In Pakistan, do you think women have found a place, a mental space, a creative space in literature, in art, and a space which is outside the caricatures of women?
See, for me, that question is nobody's going to give you your space. You have to fight for it. And if you think, if you think it's going to be distributed, then you are on the wrong track. The writers, whether it is Virginia Woolf or any other writer, you have to fight for your space. Men didn't get it free. Nobody gets anything free in this world. You have to fight. And if women are going to take on the garb of the martyr, then they have to blame themselves. They have to. Somebody has to take the step. But unfortunately, if you look at what is happening around us, we are still reinforcing the martyred woman, the suffering woman, and my place in heaven. I do not subscribe to that. I feel I have to earn my space.
Move on to the next question. We're slightly short of time.
I have a question that basically in one of his movies, Woody Allen, he picks up one of Virginia Woolf's books and he says that, oh, she was a suicidal and woman who had a mental illness, but her tragedy is romanticized by women. So how much do you think that that's true, and if you think that's wrong? Because I think that's completely wrong. So.
That's a very good question. Who's going to tackle that one? It could also take an hour, couldn't it? Emma, perhaps.
I don't particularly think that she's romanticized by women. I don't think people really understand about her suicide and what led to it or her breakdowns. But I mean, Woody Allen, who cares?
Have we got time for one more? Where have we got? We got one more in the middle somewhere. Thought there was somebody with a hand up. There's somebody right at the back, very, very right at the back.
About the stream of consciousness, we first see it in Ulysses by James Joyce, and then afterwards we see it in Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. But she rejected Ulysses as out of hand, yet she copied her style pertaining to the stream of consciousness.
So what's your
Isn't that
question?
a contradiction?
Do you have a question?
Isn't that a contradiction in behavior?
Yeah, is that a contradiction that she copied Joyce?
Sorry, I don't agree with that at all. She's made something entirely new.
Joyce was very much, for me, the innovator, and Virginia Woolf is the great artist. I don't see, Joyce as this great artist.
And she rejected Ulysses because of obscenity, not because of stream of consciousness. It had scenes of masturbation and all sorts in it, and at that time they didn't feel able to publish it.
I'd like to share one particular sense of ownership of Virginia Woolf. One of our leading Pakistani writers, Ahmed, he had problems getting his book published because it was right at a time, and he's written his book, Twilight in Delhi, before partition. I'm sorry, I'm taking, it's off the topic. But this is something very interesting, since we're talking about publication. And Ahmed couldn't find a publisher, and nobody was willing to touch because there was some problem with a particular use of phrase. Ahmed had talked about 1857 as the War of Mutiny, as the War of Independence, and his editors wanted it to be seen as mutiny. And Ahmed was a good friend of E.M. Foster. E.M. Foster was a good friend of Virginia Woolf. E.M. Foster recommended Ahmed book, and Virginia Woolf published it. So we owe.
I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. Now, just one last thing is, you, Emma, said if you're starting somewhere, for those of you who want to start somewhere, start with the letters. Adrian, which book would you start with if you were starting?
I think I would start with...
You need your microphone.
Jacob's Room.
With Jacob's Room, that's controversial. We haven't really talked about Jacob's Room.
It's a starting point.
As,
You can move on to house or whatever you like, but I think one has to start earlier.
and Zareena?
For me, it's Orlando.
Orlando. And for what I would add, for my personal thing, is Zareena mentioned Jean Rees's the White Sargasso Sea. And if you've read the whole of Virginia Woolf and you want to find one masterpiece, little small masterpiece that it directly led to, read Jean Rees's White Sargasso Sea. I hope this hasn't been a waste of time. I hope you'll go and read all these texts. Thank you very much to a very spirited panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you all leave, nobody is allowed to approach the stage, so please make your way towards the exit.